He pointed a loaded gun in my face, me a disabled black veteran in a wheelchair, because I dared to sit on a public bench with a cup of coffee and a folded American flag on my lap. Behind him stood Captain Roy Densmore, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon, eyes burning with contempt, surrounded by silence from those too afraid to speak. But what they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that the man they tried to erase had already survived a war far worse than their cowardice. And this time, I wasn't alone. This is the story of how a town's quiet cruelty exploded into national outrage. How a camera, a teenage girl, and a mural of sunflowers shattered a system built on fear. And how I, Sergeant Isaac Roman, reclaimed not just my dignity, but the very meaning of the flag I once bled for. He pointed a gun in my face, right there on the sidewalk in front of a bakery full of witnesses. Just because I sat on a bench I'd sat on every morning for the past 5 years. And standing behind him in a crisp white uniform and mirrored sunglasses was Captain Roy Densmore, the self-appointed guardian of this gentrified town, clutching his leather clipboard like it was the Holy Bible, and looking at me like I was vermin on his clean street. I could hear the woman behind the counter gasp. I could hear children crying. But I sat still. I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to. I'm Sergeant Isaac Roman, retired U.S. Army 80% disabled veteran, wheelchair-bound since the Gulf War. I've stared down tanks. I've held my brother in arms as he bled out on desert sand. But nothing prepared me for the shame of being treated like trash in the country I almost died protecting. I live in Brookridge, a tidy little town with cobblestone sidewalks and seasonal banners on lamp posts, where people sip overpriced lattes and pretend they don't see me. I'm not homeless. I have a modest apartment near the VA clinic, and every morning I wheel myself 3 blocks to that bench outside Carla's Bakery to watch the sun rise and drink my black coffee. I don't speak unless spoken to. I nod, I smile. Most days they ignore me, but then came the day the new city council passed a loitering and beautification ordinance. They didn't say it out loud, but we all knew what it meant. No old men in raggedy coats. No veterans with weathered skin. No black folks in wheelchairs ruining the aesthetic for the tourists. Captain Roy Densmore, ex-military himself, dishonorably discharged, although no one talks about that, took it upon himself to clean up the streets. He strutted around with a badge and a clipboard enforcing rules that didn't exist before he wrote them. He targeted the easy ones, people too old, too poor, too tired to fight back. That's why he zeroed in on me. But what he didn't know is that I'd fought my entire life to survive, and I wasn't going to stop now. The incident happened on a Tuesday. The sun had barely crept above the rooftops when I rolled up to my usual spot. I was wearing my pressed button-down shirt and my black veteran cap. On my lap sat a folded American flag and a small bouquet of sunflowers, gifts for my wife's grave. She loved Carla's croissants, and I'd always buy one to eat at the cemetery. I was sipping my coffee when I heard the heavy boots behind me. "You can't sit here," Officer Travis barked. I looked up slowly. He was young, maybe 25, skin pale as chalk, mouth set in a hard line. "Excuse me," I said calmly. "You're loitering. Ordinance 14B. Move along, or I'll move you myself." I blinked. "I'm not loitering. I'm drinking coffee." He stepped forward. "You think you're special. You think that hat gives you a pass." Then, without warning, he drew his firearm, not a warning shot, not a threat, but full draw barrel aimed square at my forehead. Carla screamed from inside. A child dropped a cookie and cried. "You will move," he said, "or you'll be moved in a body bag." I remember the wind stilled. I remember thinking this was it, not on a battlefield, not in a blaze of honor, but gunned down for sitting on a bench in the country I fought to defend. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I looked at him straight through the fear and into the deep, terrified ignorance behind his badge. Then came the click of a phone camera. It was a teenage girl across the street. She had her phone out recording. Her hands were trembling, but her grip didn't waver. And when Captain Densmore arrived seconds later, barking orders, telling her to delete the video, she refused. She stood her ground. Her name, I'd learn later, was Mayra Ellis. 17. Aspiring journalist. That girl may have saved my life. Densmore loomed over me, sneering. You people think you can stir up drama for sympathy. But this won't go anywhere. No one cares about a cripple with an attitude. That night, I sat in silence watching the video go viral. The internet erupted. Justice for Isaac trended worldwide. Messages poured in. Reporters, veterans, politicians. My past came flooding back years I tried to forget. I wasn't always this calm old man. I used to lead recon teams in Kandahar. I used to fix engines under gunfire. I used to run. But the war took that from me, my legs, my brothers, my peace. And now this town was trying to take what little dignity I had left. But that night also brought something else. Memories I hadn't touched in years. My wife's laugh as she danced in the kitchen. My best friend screaming into the radio during an ambush. The letters I wrote to my mother telling her I'd be okay. I wasn't okay. Not then, not now. But maybe it was time to stop pretending. Maybe it was time to fight not with weapons, but with truth. So I made a decision. No more silence. No more apologies for existing. They drew first blood thinking I'd fade away. But they were wrong. Because I may be seated, but I still stand for something. And I wasn't alone. Mayra reached out the next morning. "Mr. Roman," she said, "I want to help you tell your story." I looked at her young brave, full of fire, and I nodded. Then we do it right. We tell it all. And so began the first spark in a firestorm that would consume Brookridge. I didn't sleep that night. The moment I closed my eyes, I saw the barrel of that gun. I felt its cold breath on my forehead. My heart pounded like mortar fire even though the room was still. Trauma's funny like that. It doesn't leave with time. It hibernates, then explodes in a heartbeat. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the folded flag on my shelf, the one handed to me after my brother-in-arms. Marcus Traynor was killed by friendly fire. I'd never told anyone the full truth of that day. Maybe now I'd have to. By morning, the town had split in two. Half pretended they hadn't seen the video. The other half couldn't stop watching it. Carla left me a voicemail sobbing, apologizing for not stepping outside. I didn't blame her. Fear turns decent folks into statues. What surprised me was the envelope slipped under my door. No name, just a small handwritten note. They're going to come after you. Don't trust anyone in uniform. It was unsigned, but I recognized the handwriting. Officer Bernal, one of the few decent ones. Mayra Ellis came knocking at 9:00 a.m. Sharp, holding a notebook, a Canon DSLR camera, and the kind of unbreakable energy only teenagers possessed. Her parents were horrified she got involved, but she didn't care. She wanted the truth. She wanted justice. But most of all, she wanted the world to see what small towns did to people who didn't fit the postcard. I'm not just recording the abuse, she told me. I'm documenting the history they don't want people to know. You're part of that history. I told her my story. The real one. Born in Mississippi. Joined the Army at 18 to escape the cycle of poverty and prison that claimed most of my neighborhood. Served 12 years, survived 2 IED blasts, lost both legs from the thigh down, came back to a country that barely noticed. No parades, no medals, just a disability check and an apartment in a part of town most folks avoided. I told her about my wife Angela, a school librarian who died of cancer while we were still paying off hospital bills. I told her about the nights I wanted to give up but didn't. And I told her about that bench and why I sat there every morning because it was the only place I felt human. Mayra recorded it all. Her eyes never wavered even when mine did. She wasn't making a TikTok. She was building a case. Meanwhile, Brookridge PD doubled down. They released a statement calling me uncooperative, claimed the video was edited, claimed I lunged at Officer Travis. How does a man in a wheelchair lunge, I wondered. But lies don't need logic, just volume. And Captain Roy Densmore knew how to turn up the volume. He held a press conference in front of City Hall flanked by officers and city council members. His voice was calm. Too calm. This is not about race, he said. This is not about disability. This is about law and order. Our officers must be allowed to do their job without harassment. I watched it from my living room, rage tightening in my chest. They'd turned me into a threat, a problem, a symbol of disorder. But I knew better. The real problem wasn't me. It was what I represented, someone who couldn't be silenced, someone they couldn't control. That night, I met with the local attorney Naomi Park, a Korean-American civil rights lawyer who had taken on impossible cases and won. She didn't care about politics. She cared about principle. She watched the video. Then she watched it again. Then she looked at me and said, "We're not settling. We're suing." I wasn't looking for money. I wanted accountability. I wanted the badge that nearly ended my life to be held up to the light. Naomi filed a civil suit against the department and the city. She named Travis Densmore and even the mayor. The lawsuit hit the town like a hurricane. Suddenly, I was no longer the forgotten man on the bench. I was the man fighting back. And that scared them. The threats came quickly. My mailbox smashed. My tires slashed. One night, a brick through my window with a note attached. "Should have stayed down, soldier." But I didn't flinch. You don't survive war by hiding from bricks. You survive by knowing when to stand and when to let others stand with you. And they did. The community, the veterans, the students, the pastors, even the mothers pushing strollers past Carla's bakery, they began to rally. A candlelight vigil formed on the sidewalk where it all began. A local artist painted a mural of me and Angela me in uniform, her holding a sunflower on the side of the old post office. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about what they had tried to erase. But Densmore wasn't finished. He ordered Mayra arrested for interfering in an active police investigation. They dragged her out of class, put her in cuffs. She was 17, a child. That was the moment the scales tipped. A leaked video showed Densmore personally ordering the arrest. The internet exploded. Major news outlets picked it up. Naomi called it a gift. I called it a line crossed. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were trying to erase anyone who saw me. I went to the courthouse the next morning, in my cleanest shirt, with the flag and the sunflowers in my lap. The cameras were everywhere. Reporters shouted questions, but I said nothing. Not yet. Naomi stood before the crowd and read from the Constitution. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That includes veterans. That includes teenagers. That includes anyone who refuses to be silenced. And for the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. Not anger, not fear, but hope. Maybe we weren't alone. Maybe justice wasn't just a word whispered by the lucky. Maybe it was a fire waiting to be lit. And if so, I was ready to burn. They thought they could bury the fire, smother it with threats, slander, and fear. But they forgot what happens when a flame touches dry grass. It spreads. The town of Outrage, once so quiet, so prim and painted, had become a battlefield of truth and lies, and I was right in the middle of it. The courtroom was packed, not just with press or locals or officials, veterans in wheelchairs, students with posters, mothers with their children, all came to see what would happen when power was forced to sit under oath. I wore my black veteran cap, not out of pride, but as armor. My lawyer, Naomi Park, stood beside me like a shield, precise, unshaken, and brimming with moral fury. The defendant's bench held Captain Roy Densmore, and Officer Travis, one calm and smug, the other jittery and sweating. Mayor Annabelle Price, who once sent me Christmas cards when Angela was alive, sat behind them pretending this wasn't about race power or ego. But I saw the flicker of dread behind her eyes. She knew. Everyone did. The judge was an older black man named Justice Claymore, retired Marine appointed only months before the scandal broke. His reputation was spotless. He opened the trial with a quiet voice that carried like thunder. In this courtroom, truth will speak louder than any badge. And with that, the trial began. Naomi's first move was brutal in its elegance. She called Mayra to the stand, 17 years old. Small frame, fists clenched in her lap. But when she spoke, she was fire. I recorded what I saw she said. A police officer pointing a loaded gun at a man in a wheelchair. Not because he was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient. The defense objected. Overruled. Mayra continued. I didn't see fear in Officer Travis's eyes. I saw contempt. And I've seen that look before. Every black student in Outrage High has seen it. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge didn't flinch. Neither did I. Naomi then presented the full, unedited footage on the court screen. Silence fell. There, I was calm, still respectful. Travis agitated, yelling. And then the gun. The weapon raised at a man who couldn't even run if he wanted to. He called me a threat, I whispered under my breath. But I was the one who needed protection. The footage ended with Densmore shouting at Mayra. The courtroom absorbed it like a punch to the chest. The prosecution tried to spin it, claimed I had a history of confrontations, that my tone was provocative, that my mere presence escalated the situation. Naomi responded with my military record, 12 years of decorated service, multiple citations for bravery, no history of violence. Then came the testimony from other veterans, white, black, brown, old, and young. They painted the picture of a man who spent his mornings feeding birds, not breaking laws. Carla testified next. He sat there with his coffee and sunflowers, she said, choking back tears. He was the soul of this street. That's when the twist came. Naomi submitted a sealed document. The judge reviewed it, then slowly nodded. This court accepts the document as evidence, he said, and I will allow it to be read. It was an internal affairs file, unsealed by subpoena. It revealed that Captain Roy Densmore had been dishonorably discharged from the military for abusive conduct, specifically for drawing a weapon on an unarmed interpreter during a 2009 deployment. The same pattern. The same rage. Buried under medals and paperwork, the courtroom erupted. Reporters leapt from their chairs. Densmore's face drained of color. Travis looked like he was about to vomit. Naomi delivered the blow. This is not about one moment. This is about a man who weaponized authority, a town that looked away, and a justice system that's now watching. The judge called for recess. I rolled out into the hallway, my hands shaking, the old pain flaring in my stumps. But in that moment, I felt taller than I ever had. A little boy approached me. Couldn't have been older than 8. Brown skin, bright eyes. He handed me a card. My granddad says you're a real hero. I swallowed hard, opened the card. It read, "Thank you for sitting still when they tried to move you." I couldn't speak. Outside, the town was changing. The mural of me and Angela had grown. Someone added a quote below it, "Silence is not peace." More vigils, more signs, more people refusing to look away. But Densmore wasn't done. That night, the bakery caught fire. Arson, no suspects. Carla's livelihood, her memories gone in smoke. She called me crying, not for herself, but for the birds. The ones that gathered outside every morning waiting for crumbs from my hands. "I think they knew you were the only one who saw them," she said. That night I sat alone with the broken pieces, not just of buildings, but of trust. I stared at the flag again, not the one folded on my shelf, the one I wore inside, the invisible one that told me this country was worth believing in. Was it? The answer didn't come right away. But as I watched footage of strangers holding signs with my name, as I read messages from people across the country who had been silenced too, I realized something. Maybe the flag wasn't perfect, but neither was I. And still, I never stopped showing up. Neither should it. You learn a lot about people when you become a symbol. Some see a man in a wheelchair and decide he must be weak. Others see a black man and decide he must be dangerous. A few see both and decide he's better off invisible. But the moment I chose to fight back, I stopped being just a man. I became a mirror. And this town. It didn't like its reflection. Carla's bakery still smoldered 2 days after the fire. The firefighters called it suspicious. I called it a message. Stay quiet, or we'll burn the next thing you love. Mayra was shaken. She came to my apartment, eyes wide, clutching her camera like a lifeline. "They're escalating," she said. I nodded. That's what bullies do when they feel exposed. We reviewed the footage again, frame by frame, pixel by pixel. Naomi wanted to be sure nothing had been altered. It hadn't. If anything, it had become more damning with time. People from all over the country were sending in their own stories, videos of harassment, photos of bruises, receipts of silencing. Brookridge wasn't the only town infected. It was just the first one under the microscope. Still, fear was growing. I got a call from Officer Bernal, the man who'd warned me with the note. He whispered like the walls could hear. They're planning something he said. Densmore's meeting with a private security group. Not cops. Mercs. I blinked. To do what? I don't know, but they're calling it crowd control. Watch your back, Sergeant. That night, the town square was filled with candles and chants. Students, veterans, nurses. A choir sang, "A change is gonna come." But across the street, black vans with tinted windows began to appear. Men in earpieces stood like statues, not local, not friendly, not bound by the same rules. Naomi filed an injunction. No private force can interfere with civil protests, she said. But the mayor was quiet. Her silence to me was consent. And then on the sixth night of protests, the unthinkable happened. I was returning home when a black SUV cut me off at the curb. Two men jumped out, masks on, tasers drawn. They didn't ask questions. They didn't give warnings. They just grabbed me, lifted me like luggage, and threw me in the back seat. The smell of chemicals and leather burned my nostrils. I fought, but with no legs and a frail upper body, there wasn't much I could do. They shoved a cloth in my mouth and whispered, "You should have stayed quiet." I blacked out. When I woke, I was in a storage room. No windows, just flickering light and cement walls. My chair was gone. My wrists hurt. I wasn't tied, but I couldn't stand. Then the door creaked open. Captain Roy Densmore entered alone. He walked with the calm of a man who thought himself untouchable. "You embarrassed me, Sergeant," he said. "Made me a joke. People like you think you're safe just because you bled for a flag. But that flag doesn't protect people like you. Not anymore." I stared at him, the pain surging through my shoulders, my pride shattered but not gone. "You're not a captain," I whispered. "You're a coward in a costume." His eyes twitched. "You don't get it, do you? This town runs because people fear the right things. Law, order, uniforms." He leaned in, "And when people stop fearing those things, they start rioting. That's what you started." "No," I said. I reminded them they didn't have to be afraid. He raised his fist. I didn't blink. And then chaos. The door slammed open. Flashlight beams. Screams. A voice I knew shouted, "Step away from him." Hands up. Officer Bernal. And behind him, Naomi, the press, a camera crew, and half the town's clergy. The raid had been live-streamed. Mayra had hacked into the security grid. Carla had alerted the protest leaders when I didn't come back. And Naomi, God bless that woman, filed an emergency motion that allowed them to storm the warehouse with legal force. Densmore was cuffed. The men who took me vanished. They wheeled me out under a sky full of stars and sirens. I'd never felt more broken or more free. The town erupted, not in violence, but in song. Students sang outside the police department. Veterans stood watch outside my home. For the first time in decades, Brookridge became what it pretended to be, honest, brave, awake. And then came the call. The Department of Justice. They wanted to file federal charges, civil rights violations, abuse of authority, conspiracy to intimidate. It was bigger than I'd ever imagined. The next day, Captain Roy Densmore was escorted from City Hall in shackles, and for the first time in a long time, I wept not for pain, but for justice. They say justice moves slowly. But that morning, as the sun rose behind the courthouse and Captain Roy Densmore was led inside in chains, I saw how quickly justice could run when enough people refused to crawl. The sound of those handcuffs clinking against his belt was louder than any courtroom gavel. It wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the collapse of a lie. And I, Sergeant Isaac Roman, who once sat invisible on a bench, had become the proof they couldn't silence. I was wheeled into court by Naomi. I wore my army pin on my lapel, my veteran cap on my head. The press swarmed. Flashes lit up my face like strobe lights. But I wasn't there to perform. I was there to bear witness. Inside, the gallery was so full, they opened a second room with monitors. Carla sat front row, face pale but proud. Mayra clutched her notepad like scripture. Officer Bernal, now suspended for whistleblowing, stood quietly near the exit, arms folded, his eyes locked on Densmore. The federal prosecutor took the floor, her voice crisp and cold. The United States versus Roy Densmore is not a case about one man. It is about a culture of impunity, a culture where badges became masks and silence became policy. Then came the evidence. They played footage, not just from my case, but from years back. Redacted reports, internal complaints, buried civilians intimidated a culture of fear, upheld by forged paperwork and winked approvals. Densmore wasn't a bad apple. He was the orchard keeper, and the roots ran deep. Naomi was called to testify not as my attorney, but as an expert witness in systemic abuse cases. She spoke like a blade. When people in power punish others for being seen, heard, or remembered, it ceases to be law enforcement. It becomes authoritarianism. I watched Densmore shift uncomfortably in his chair. For the first time, his smirk was gone. The defense tried to frame him as a man under stress. He was protecting the town from disruption, his lawyer claimed. Keeping order in uncertain times. Naomi's response was surgical. If the presence of a black veteran in a wheelchair is what you call disruption, then your definition of order is oppression. Applause echoed, and the judge didn't stop it. Justice Claymore nodded solemnly. Let the court feel the pulse of the people. But the moment that changed everything came next. The prosecution called Angela Roman to the stand. I froze. My wife had been dead for years. And then the bailiff wheeled out a monitor, a recorded video from her last days. A hospice nurse had helped her record it. It was meant for me. But after hearing what happened, she sent it to Naomi. Angela's face filled the screen, pale, thin, radiant. If you're watching this, she said, voice like a song I hadn't heard in years, you've probably forgotten how brave you are. Let me remind you. You fought wars most people don't even read about. You've seen death and chose life. And every morning you bought sunflowers for a woman who could no longer smell them. Isaac, you are not a threat. You are a light. If someone's trying to put it out, then they're afraid of what you reveal. Silence. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Just the sound of my heart breaking and rebuilding in the same breath. The jury was made up of 9 locals, 3 from neighboring counties. 1 was a Vietnam vet. 1 was a young teacher. 1 had served as mayor before Annabelle Price. They deliberated less than 4 hours. On all counts, the forewoman said we find the defendant guilty. Densmore didn't flinch. He looked straight at me as they cuffed him again. But this time, it wasn't defiance in his eyes. It was fear. Outside the courthouse, the town was waiting. Not with torches, but with hope. They lifted Myra on their shoulders. Veterans saluted. Carla handed out sunflower pins. And I wheeled to the mural. Someone had added a second figure beside me and Angela, a little girl holding a camera. "Who did that?" I asked. Mayra smiled. A student. Said she wanted to make sure everyone who stood up was remembered. That night, under the soft streetlights, Carla reopened her bakery in a temporary tent. The first batch of croissants went to the protesters. The second to the police officers who refused to look away. The third was handed to me, still warm. "I saved one for Angela," she whispered. I sat on that bench again. This time, no cops, no clipboard, no glares, just kids laughing, birds pecking at crumbs, and me, finally, still but not invisible. They say victory is loud cheers, fireworks, roaring crowds, but the day after Densmore's conviction, it was the silence that struck me most. A different kind of silence. Not the uneasy hush of people pretending not to see me. Not the heavy stillness of injustice. This silence was peace. The kind that lives between breaths, the kind my wife used to hum into my chest when the nightmares came. It blanketed Brookridge that morning tender and cautious, like the town wasn't quite sure how to live in a world where truth had won. But truth, I learned, doesn't stop at verdicts. That afternoon, Naomi arrived at my door with a man I hadn't seen in 30 years. Lieutenant Marcus Trainor's younger brother, Deshawn. He stepped into my apartment, glanced at the folded flag above my fireplace, and said softly, "I watched the trial. Marcus would have been proud of you, and ashamed it took this long." We sat, talked, laughed even, and then Deshawn handed me something wrapped in an old cloth. I opened it with shaking hands. It was a military-issue dog tag. "Marcus's. I found it cleaning out my mother's house," Deshawn said. "Figured it belonged next to the man who carried him out of the fire." I clutched it like a relic. "Thank you," I whispered. But he wasn't done. "There's something else. About that day, the friendly fire. It wasn't an accident." I looked up stunned. Deshawn pulled out a faded folder. "After what happened with you, I started digging. This was buried in Pentagon archives. Marcus died because your CO Captain Densmore misread coordinates. Then tried to cover it up. My body went numb. Marcus wasn't just your friend," he said. "He was Densmore's scapegoat." Naomi read through the documents. Her lips curled in disbelief. "We could indict on this. Federal cover-up. Military malpractice. We could open everything. But I couldn't move. The walls pressed inward. The war I left behind had followed me home. That night I wheeled to the mural. Stared at the painted version of Marcus that now appeared in the background, a ghost with soft eyes standing behind me and Angela. The artist added him after the trial. No one asked. They just knew. I sat there for hours, remembering his laugh, his swagger, the way he sang Motown on patrol, and I made a vow he would not be forgotten. The next day, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced an investigation into misconduct linked to Densmore's unit. The military brass tried to stay quiet, but they couldn't anymore. Not after the video. Not after the trial. Not after the mural was shared 10 million times. Brookridge became a national case study. Mayra, now the town's youngest accredited journalist, received a journalism scholarship from Columbia. Carla's bakery was rebuilt, funded entirely by donations from strangers. Officer Bernal was reinstated with honors. And me. I became something I never asked to be. A symbol. People wrote to me. Called me hero. Called me resilient. But I wasn't always strong. Some nights I still woke screaming. Some days I still looked at the door and flinched. And yet every morning I returned to that bench. with coffee, with sunflowers, with the flag. One morning, a little girl named Alina, maybe 6, maybe 7, came up to me holding a crayon drawing. It was me in my wheelchair surrounded by sunflowers, birds, and children. She pointed to the flag. "My mom said that means you're brave." I smiled. "It means I love something enough to protect it." She tilted her head. "Like your wife." I nodded. Then she added, "Can I sit with you?" So we sat. The town moving around us. Old neighbors who once looked away now nodding. A barista bringing me free coffee without a word. The mayor's office calling to offer a public apology. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because justice, real justice, isn't always a headline or a prison sentence. Sometimes it's a child sitting beside you. Sometimes it's the wind no longer pushing against you. Sometimes it's simply being seen. And on that bench, under that sky, next to that little girl, I was finally visible. It rained on the day of the memorial. Not a storm, not a downpour. Just a steady, gentle rain, the kind that felt less like punishment and more like cleansing. We held it in the courtyard behind City Hall beneath the very flag Captain Roy Densmore once used to justify his tyranny. That flag now flew for someone else, for something else. For all of us who had ever been told to move to disappear, to be quiet. I wore my uniform jacket that morning, the one with the missing buttons and faded name patch. Angela used to tease me about never getting it tailored, but I wore it as it was worn like me. Honest, like the life I fought to reclaim. Naomi stood beside me reading names of veterans buried without ceremony. Carla passed out the free croissants and coffee. Mayra, holding a press badge now official, filmed it all not for clicks or headlines, but for truth. And then it was my turn. I wheeled to the podium. The mic was too high. I didn't adjust it. I looked at the crowd. Students, cops, elders, children, reporters, priests, people who once saw me as a stranger. Now they saw me as something else. I cleared my throat. "My name is Sergeant Isaac Roman. I am not a threat. I am not a mistake. I am not what they tried to call me." The wind blew gentle but certain. I sat on a bench. They pointed a gun at me. And now I stand before you not because I fought harder, but because you finally looked. You saw. You chose to stand with me. So today I don't speak for myself. I speak for those who never got their moment. For Marcus Traynor, who died serving a country that never said thank you. For Angela Roman, who believed I was still whole when I felt broken. For Mayra Ellis, who proved courage has no age. For every person who has ever been told they were too much or not enough, this flag flies for you now. There was no applause, just silence. The good kind. The sacred kind. Then someone began to sing. A single voice. Soft, raw. "This land is your land. This land is my land." And one by one they joined in, the entire town. After the ceremony, I stayed behind, alone with the mural. Someone had updated it again. Now, Marcus, Angela Mayra, and even little Alina were in it, standing behind me, sunflowers in hand like guardians. My wheelchair was painted gold wheels, glowing like sunlight. I don't cry often, but I did then. And then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Deshaun. "They're naming the new Veterans Center after you," he said. I laughed. Don't they know I still owe the library late fees? But in truth, I was humbled. Humbled in the way that only those who've lost everything can be. Naomi approached with final news. The Department of Defense had officially declassified the cover-up involving Densmore's wartime crimes. Posthumous medals were being issued. Marcus's name would be cleared. A military funeral. Full honors. I asked if I could deliver the eulogy. She nodded. They already requested it. Later that evening, I returned to the bench. My bench. The one they tried to take. Now engraved with my name. Not for ego. For remembrance. I sat with my coffee and sunflowers. The birds gathered again as they always had. And Alina, in her little yellow raincoat, sat beside me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Mr. Roman," she asked, "do you still love the flag?" I looked at it, waving in the wind, no longer heavy with hypocrisy, but lifted by something real. "Yes," I said, because it finally learned how to love me back. We sat there not speaking, just breathing. Just existing, not as enemies, not as problems, but as people. And as the rain eased and the sun peeked through, I realized this fight had never been about one man in a wheelchair or one badge on a crooked chest. It had always been about what kind of country we wanted to be. And for the first time in a long time, I believed we were getting there. In the end, it wasn't rage that changed my town. It wasn't lawsuits or viral videos or even the sight of a man in a wheelchair refusing to flinch. What changed everything, what shattered the silence, was the truth. Spoken, seen, believed. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment someone refuses to stay invisible. I learned that dignity isn't given. It's claimed. That the scars we carry on our bodies, our hearts, our histories, don't make us weak. They make us undeniable. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is sit still and refuse to move. To everyone out there who's ever been told to stay quiet, to move along, to disappear, know this, your presence is power. Your truth is fire. And when you speak it, when you live it, the world has no choice but to listen. If this story moved, you hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in my place? Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a real story that dares to speak truth to power. Because on this channel, we don't just tell stories. We rewrite history.